Theists report all kinds of religious supporting experiences, but are these experiences valid? Modern science says no, but it doesn't take a degree to see the kind of irrational confirmation bias that people who have these supposed experiences are engaged in. Let's look into that next. Has this ever happened to you? You're just hanging out, minding your own business, and you run into someone who says they're absolutely convinced that God is real because they had some amazing experience that can only be explained by God, their God, and therefore their religion, whatever it happens to be, must be right, and because they're convinced, you ought to be too. And they don't seem to realize just how stupid this all is. Not only because they bought into it irrationally, but because they expect everyone else to do so as well. So today, I wanted to take a look at the absurdity of supposed religious experiences and why none of it is at all impressive to the non-believer, and it shouldn't be to the believer either. So let's start off with an example of a God experience, and for this, I just did a Google search for religious experiences, intending to just pick one at random, and honestly, it was hard to find anyone actually describing what they called a religious experience. Now, I've found this to be true offline as well. People will say, I had an experience, but they're really hesitant to tell you what that experience actually was. I finally found one. And this isn't intended to be a good example or a bad example, it's just an example. So I'm going to read this to you. A couple of years ago, I woke up one morning and said good morning to my daughter. I had a thought. I wondered if anyone ever says good morning to God. Without any further thought, I said, good morning, God. Instantaneously, I felt such an incredible amount of love that it took my breath away. Imagine back when you first met your wife or your husband. Do you remember how loved that you felt? Well, imagine that times 100 or more, and you get the sensation I felt. It was pure. It was powerful. I stopped thinking, maybe or maybe not, he could be real, to, I know for a fact he is real. My experience with God is short, and it isn't fancy, but it's real. Why can't this guy spell real? Seriously, why? Anyway, do I go to church? Very rarely, but I have a very strong faith now, and yes, it's changed my perspective on life. The problem with this example is that it really doesn't mean anything. This guy did something, he says he felt something, and he asserted without evidence that what he felt was God, and that was all there was to it. There's no evidence this was actually God. In fact, had this guy been in a country where, say, Hinduism was the dominant cultural delusion, he very well might have identified the experience to have been caused by Krishna. It could have been caused by the flying spaghetti monster or alien mind control rays. Or it could have been something strange in his head that he simply arbitrarily attributed to a cause and is now believing something for which there's no good reason to think is true. Now, these might be very powerful emotional experiences for the individual, but in all of the decades that I've talked to people with these supposed experiences, I've never yet met one that has tried to independently and intellectually validate the experience at all. Not one. It doesn't happen, or at least if it does, then the person comes to the conclusion that no gods were involved and just goes on with their lives. Now, also, while I was poking around online, I found the Spiritual Competency Resource Center, and there's a page where a Catholic chaplain says he's found that the mentally insane have legitimate religious experiences. I think you're mistaking insanity for legitimacy, Padre, because your confirmation bias is working overtime. He says, many patients over the years have spoken to me of their religious experience, and I have found their stories to be quite genuine and quite believable. Their experience of the divine, the spiritual, is healthy and life-giving. Of course, discernment is important, but we'll ignore that when it is inconvenient. But it is important not to presume that certain kinds of religious experience or behavior are simply part of the illness. Of course, this assumes without evidence that there's any such thing as the divine in the first place. Relying on someone who has a personal and financial stake in maintaining the belief in the spiritual seems a bit questionable at best. And even if we look at people hospitalized for mental problems, such as one woman who is being treated for a manic episode, she said, "Since being discharged, my appreciation for music, poetry, and the Spanish mystics have been enhanced, and I've gained insight into the need of others, which has made the whole experience worthwhile." Okay, fine. You got something subjectively valuable out of it. That doesn't mean it had anything to do with gods. That seems to be a very common claim, though. Not only that if you had a positive, life-changing experience, God did it, but if you had a terrible, damaging experience, then it must have been the fault of Satan. Maybe it was just your brain and had nothing at all to do with imaginary friends. Did you stop to think about that? And I don't want to insinuate that everyone that has a so-called religious experience is insane. I think the vast majority of them are simply mistaken. They're having an experience they can't explain, whatever that might have been, and then they're claiming the experience came from a source that they simply cannot rationally justify. They're doing it for entirely emotional reasons, kind of an "it seems to me" thing, where cultural indoctrination and confirmation bias play a huge role. You don't see people having religious experiences with gods when they have no past experience with those gods. You don't see many people in England, for example, having spiritual experiences with the Ashanti deity Anansi. No one is claiming to have experienced Ra. It's always a god that they already follow, or a religion they were raised with, or a religion that is common in their culture. You never get someone saying, "Well, I had this spiritual experience, and they said their name was, Cthulhu, and I have no idea who that is." It doesn't happen because none of the supposed spiritual experiences happen as described. They just don't. Sure, something weird might happen, something that you cannot explain, but the explanation is never demonstrably God. That's the rationalization. It's the interpretation that you attach to your unexplained experience just to make sense of it in your own head. But just because this is a story that you're telling yourself for emotional reasons, it doesn't make the story true. This is not by any means a new idea. In fact, a religious experience is defined as a subjective experience that is interpreted within a religious framework. It began, at least to be identified as such, in the 19th century by religious people who were fighting against the growing rationalism and secularization of Western society. And so they started having experiences, or at least reported having experiences, and these experiences can and have been studied by science, and we found that there are things that you can do that make these experiences more likely. Things like strenuous exercise, causing yourself extreme pain, taking mind-altering drugs, putting yourself into a meditative state, etc. And of course, mental damage is a big part of it. Schizophrenia and temporal lobe epilepsy are both well known to cause religious experiences, and if those experiences can be linked to physical activity and brain states, then they're not experiences with the divine, just the result of chemical and electrical stimulation in the brain. I'm sorry, but that's all this is. It's all we have any evidence of. I know that won't matter to the religious, but this is why it doesn't and shouldn't impress anyone else. Okay, you had an experience. That's fine. But that's only half of the phenomena. The other part, the more important part, is finding out what actually happened. And that's the part the religious don't want to talk about. But science is finding that having these kinds of life-changing religious experiences might be actually causing brain damage. Researchers at Duke University have discovered a greater chance of brain atrophy in the hippocampus among some religious groups than among those with no religious affiliation. Religion is literally rotting their brains. And this tends to be more prevalent in people who engage in extreme meditation and prayer, things that are more likely to bring about the subjective religious experiences. The atrophy seems to be more pronounced in people who describe themselves as born again, people who are more likely to have had these major religious experiences. So yes, for the people who are having these experiences, there is probably something seriously wrong with you. And even if you don't have anything wrong with your brain yet, you're certainly not evaluating the supposed experiences rationally. You are seeing what you want to see, not what's actually there. You are making claims about your experience that you cannot intellectually justify, just so that your biases can be confirmed. This is not something that you ought to be proud of. Yes, something strange and unexplained might have happened to you. But if you never find out what it was, what it actually was, if you just make up something emotionally comforting and stop caring about the truth, then what was the real value of that experience? To make you feel good about something you're already irrationally convinced is true? Okay, that's pretty sad if you ask me. And I will tell you that if you bring your experience to me and expect me to be impressed, I'm not going to be, because you're not impressing anyone but yourself. And unfortunately, you seem to have some pretty low standards. Maybe you should do something about that.